Hello. Welcome to the show. My name is Bret. This is the internet. I'm live. Got some guests today. So we're going to talk about orchestration. That's going to be our focus today. But before we get into that and introduce my wonderful guest, I want to just give you Happy New Year, by the way. Yay. And then let's real quick go through some of the details. So if you haven't been in this live show before, it's a podcast. You can go over to my website. All the links are below. You can check out the podcast that comes out weeks later, sometimes a month or two later, just depending on how many we have in the queue. Thank you so much to the patrons that support this show, all you Patreon members that are giving me a little bit of a coffee every month, and I really appreciate that. If you want to support this show, the podcast, any of my free open source content, all that stuff, you can support me here. You don't have to, by the way, pay me anything. You just click the follow button right there on patreon.com/Bret Fisher. If you click that follow button, then you get all my updates. That's about once a week. It talks about the open source examples I'm making, maybe some new projects I'm doing, or free videos, whatever, whoever's going to be on the show. It's all in there. So I try to minimize the spam and just focus on what I'm creating here. So thank you so much. All right. And lastly, if you didn't know about our server, we have a DevOps server on Discord. You can go check that out. Link above, right above here. And join now I think it's over 8,000. I think we're over 8,000 people now. So that's where we just talk DevOps all day long. And I hope you'll join us. Stick around. All right. Let's get to it. All the way, actually, from Reno, right? All the way from Reno. I was like, I didn't know where you were from, but you just did say that. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to dive into some DevOps and Docker talk.
Yeah. All right, so let me give everybody a quick take on Jake. He's 15 years as a developer, cloud and infrastructure, all that stuff. Got a great background, similar backgrounds we figured out already. Similar interest as well. And he founded a new company. What year did you found this company, by the way? I don't think.
So we started Building Cycle in late 2015.
Okay. So a ways ago, and you're the founder and CEO, and you've been doing that ever since, right?
Yeah. Yep. I started Cycle in 2015. Before that was had a dev shop that I had for a couple of years, and then before that was infrastructure.
Right.
So infrastructure, infrastructure, dev shop, back to infrastructure. It's a better world to live in.
Right. It's hard to focus in my career. It's random. Like if you look at my resume, it would just be like, does this guy even know what he's doing? So I appreciate that you're all a little bit. It's always nice to do some infrastructure and some development, because I think that both those perspectives really add value to each other, right? Like I love when a developer understands infrastructure, has some experience in infrastructure, because I come from that background, and vice versa is also true. So great to have you on the show. So real quick, tell us a little bit about your background before Cycle. Like what were you doing then?
Yeah, so started teaching myself to code, or how to code, when I was mid-teens. When I was 18, I worked for a company named SingleHop, which was one of the earlier bare metal as a service infrastructure providers. Worked there for a number of years. They've since been acquired. I think back in 2016 they were acquired. But yeah, I worked there for a number of years, and then as I just mentioned, after that, I was like, I have these entrepreneurial kind of urges. Let's build a dev shop and build products for other companies. In the process of building these products for other companies, this was before Docker. It was actually right around the time that Docker was coming out, but there's so many times we're going through that process of building these products. You had to go through that entire DevOps lifecycle every single time. And at one point I was like, there has to be an easier way to do this. And that was right around the time that, when I started coming to that conclusion, the Docker started to grow in popularity. And then I was like, well, okay, Docker's growing. It's a great tool. I love how easy it's made a lot of these things. And then it was kind of taking that and pairing that back with OpenStack, because I was a contributor for OpenStack back in the day, and I was running a lot of the OpenStack stuff for Single Hop. That I kind of pair those two, and I was like, well, like, what can I do with all of that previous knowledge that can help make containers even easier? And that's what led to the idea of I should build Cycle.
I'm just gonna quit my job and do something totally not usual.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of startup failures myself. So I understand the startup part. I don't understand the winning part. So congratulations on being successful, having a big team. That's exciting. So my little startup hat, I put it on. I remember, all those startup conferences and all that bootstrapping vibe. So that I'm sure that was really exciting times in the beginning. I actually just went through your yearly recap, so it sounds like you guys did a lot in 2021. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I think so. We talk about orchestration a lot on this show. Kubernetes isn't in the name, but it all started back in the day with, early days were Mesos and Swarm and early Kubernetes and ECS, and then we started to see all sorts of experiments and other orchestrators. HashiCorp still has theirs, and Azure I think made one, and we had this sort of explosion of ways to deploy and manage containers. And now, much to my chagrin, Kubernetes has sucked all the oxygen out of the room, right? So the internet, even though there's all these other orchestrators and options for how you can run containers, and the clouds are always coming up with new ways to run containers, I feel like Kubernetes still gets so much play, even though it's not always the right thing, and it's tough for people to know when they shouldn't use Kubernetes. So can we talk about that for a minute? Like, what is your perspective on why you shouldn't, when you shouldn't, or what things you should consider for not using Kubernetes?
Well, I think there's a good amount to talk about there, but adding maybe some initial context of why we initially came up with the idea of should we go a different direction than Kubernetes, right?
Right.
And so like I just mentioned with OpenStack, being a developer in that ecosystem, we saw what happened when you had all these companies kind of get involved and say, hey, OpenStack should do this, OpenStack should do this, to the point of where everyone was trying to take OpenStack and solve every single issue with it.
Right.
And so when Docker came around and then we started to see Kubernetes, my kind of assumption was like, all right, we saw this happen with OpenStack. At some point, this is going to probably happen with Kubernetes. It might be years in the future. I mean, we're seeing it happen now. Just to the point you just made of everyone has a Kubernetes, a version of Kubernetes, a distribution of Kubernetes. Everyone is doing it now, right? But the problem with that is that when everyone tries to take Kubernetes and solve every single issue with it, now if you want to run, we've seen people spin up Kubernetes just to run a blog. And it's like, why, right? And now with Cycle, obviously, you can. I mean, it's like, I'm not saying that Cycle is made for just hosting blogs. Like, people use Cycle for building some really complex things. We have a company that is building a competitor to AWS Lambda on top of Cycle right now. So you can build really complex and neat things on it. But it was simply that idea is that as time goes on, sometimes these open source solutions end up getting so complex because there's so many different people pulling in different directions that you end up in this kind of situation where the complexity outweighs the gains, right? And so with Cycle, the idea was, all right, let's build a platform that only focuses on the 80%. When we are sitting around and figuring out new features, what we're going to work on next, etc., we have this very defined filter within our company is, will this benefit 80% or more of our customers? Right. And if the answer is no, we might open a door, or we might have like an API endpoint that helps people achieve that functionality, but we won't build it into the system itself. And the end result is this platform that where you might have some companies that use maybe 10-15% of Kubernetes. If you were to break down every single feature, Cycle's built around this position where Cycle's built around this position that most of our users, if not all, should be using just about every one of our features. And so it's just one of those quality over quantity, type approaches.
Right. So when we get into a lot of these, we obviously cloud native has spawned, 1,000 ideas, right? So one of the challenges, especially with having all you great people on this show, is figuring out when we should, where your product fits and how I should put this in my tool bag and figure out when I want to look at it. So what are the major problems that you feel like Cycle kind of solves?
So there's, Cycle provides value in a lot of things, but one of the biggest, and or one of the biggest things that we really add benefit to, is the fact that with Kubernetes, if you're running it, many times, I mean, I know there's some managed platforms out there, but many times you're responsible for maintaining all the updates to it. So whenever there's a new version of Kubernetes, you have to apply it, and even if you're on a platform that can automatically apply that update, you're worrying about like, hey, what got deprecated, what is no longer relevant, what APIs did I just break, things like that. And with Cycle, we've taken a SaaS approach to container orchestration, where our customers are still able to own their infrastructure, own their data. They get to choose their cloud providers, but Cycle, our platform, will push out updates automatically every 2 to 3 weeks to all of our customer infrastructure. So all of the hundreds of servers that are connected to Cycle today are all running the latest version of Cycle. So it's really neat because if Datadog did a report, it was either last year or the year before. I don't know. Time's a bit of a blur these days. But Datadog did a report where, from all the metrics that they were able to kind of sift through, the average deployed version of Kubernetes at the time of report was 17 and a half months out of date. Right. And so then when you're in the situation where you have these people that are like, hey, I have security vulnerabilities, like someone just got into our infrastructure. Why? And, all these just kind of detailing issues, or, hey, I just installed this new package and it doesn't work with my version of Kubernetes or whatever. There's a whole bunch of different kind of cases you can go down with that. There's just, we've seen time and time again where companies will make a large investment into Kubernetes up front, and then as time goes on, once they have everything working, it'll just be one of those things like, well, it works, and they'll just stop maintaining it. Right?
Yeah.
They won't touch it anymore. And so that's one of the common things we've seen with companies moving from Kubernetes over to Cycle. Is it was these CTOs, these VP of engineerings that were saying like, it felt like once we got something running with Kubernetes, we were doing the exact same thing 6 months later, and we that at the end of the day, it didn't help us be a better company. And so we have companies. So in talking about the problems that we solve, it's being always up to date. It's not needing a DevOps team to maintain your underlying infrastructure and maintain your orchestration layer. It's allowing companies to double down on building their development teams and focusing on writing code and not maintaining the underlying infrastructure as part of that process.
Right. Freeing up people to do other work. And that's very nice because, I haven't met a DevOps team or a developer team or SRE team that has free time.
Yep.
I mean, I haven't met anyone who doesn't have a huge backlog and they're just trying to manage the onslaught of maintenance tasks. And I think there was a Docker report. Well, they made their own little marketing report 5 or 6 years ago when they were still trying to explain why Docker was relevant. And one of I think they pulled a lot of these stats from Gartner, and I remember one of them was shocking to me, where it was like 80% or 70% or something of a DevOps team or developers team time is maintenance. And that as we, and being a sysadmin and running data centers for the last 25 years, the team, I always see a team work until they have no time left for new innovation because they're just saddled with too much obligation of existing apps, existing infrastructure, and then they just end up having to grow the team. And I love this trend that I feel like we're finally getting consensus on a majority of teams that we need to finally follow some of the DevOps principles of putting time back into the infrastructure, back into the systems for maintenance. But so many teams are still not doing that, right? They're not dividing their time properly and saying no to new things when they need to manage infrastructure. They're losing these battles a lot of times. And that's kind of what my whole consulting practice has been about, is helping the teams get over some of those humps, because the Googles of the world don't hire me. It's usually the teams that are struggling to just move forward, and they need some Kubernetes and Docker guidance or something like that. Um, so, what kind of when you I know this is probably anecdotal and stuff, but when you look at your customers that are on board, what kind of time do you see freeing up from them? Do you get information from clients like on how much time they get back or how much time they've saved by moving the cycle and not having to manage their own Kubernetes?
Yeah, so well, we've learned about it in a number of different ways. The biggest proof point that Cycles have been able to accomplish its mission, or at least I mean, I don't think that mission ever ends, but we are continuing to push forward towards it. Is that out of all of our customers, I only know of two of them that employ a DevOps engineer. For most of our customers that have come to us and said, hey, maybe one of our DevOps engineers left, or we're getting ready to scale our DevOps team, and in the process of finding DevOps engineers, we came across Cycle, and a Cycle solution that can help us or prevent us from needing to scale that DevOps team. Can we take our existing DevOps team and empower them to do more? Are we able to empower our developers to do what you would traditionally need a DevOps team to do? And so, thankfully, our story has worked out to where the answer to most of those companies has been yes. And I think as we continue to grow our customer base and things, we'll as we get into larger companies, I think many of these companies will still end up having DevOps teams, but we will be able to empower those DevOps teams to to what you just said, be able to do a lot more and have considerable less amount of technical debt that they're managing in the process. It'll allow them to really double down on the things that can actually help move companies forward, and a lot less time on maintenance. Because, like as you were mentioning with that Gartner report, it's similar to I think it was a Forrester report that came out in 2019 that said most companies that are updating between their different versions of their container orchestration platforms, like if they're using Kubernetes and they're updating, this Forrester report came out and said that for most companies, they found that it was easier to deploy a brand new cluster with the new version and migrate to it
Right.
than update an existing. And it's like, if you have to do that every 6 months, of course you're going to have a huge amount of technical debt because you're never getting ahead.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, that's true. And the big updates are always scary. And, even when you think everything's redundant, you always find out that there's one thing that isn't.
Yep.
Yeah. So, you're right. And I do see that trend with the teams when the teams that figure out their automation and figure out how to truly not have drift over time, essentially, the cluster swap or the cluster migration. I think you're right. I tend to see that as a more mature option as people get more sophisticated, because it's almost like a team maturity idea, where most people wouldn't consider, every time I do an upgrade to completely swap clusters. But if you can get your automation dialed in a little bit, which takes a lot of work, you can probably achieve that. What do you see as like the typical migration pattern? So if I'm someone who has Kubernetes on AWS, I'm using EKS or something like that, and we're not using Fargate, so we're managing the nodes and we're having to deal with updates, and we've got people dealing with all of the complexities of AWS for just getting that Kubernetes cluster to work right and have the storage and blah blah blah. What's the migration look like for them?
So that's one of the things, I don't think we have a defined pattern for.
Okay.
The customers that we're going after today, we found that our niche is going after greenfield development, right?
Okay.
So these are companies that they might already be existing companies, but they're getting ready to start new products and services where they have not yet made a lot of those decisions. And so we can say, hey, instead of spending time migrating your existing stuff and to figure out if Cycle is a good solution for you, let's use Cycle for your next project. And if that's a good fit, then we can move your other stuff over. And so that's been the common theme so far, is that out of our customers, I'd say probably 80% of them are companies that came to Cycle with a new product that they were building. So that way it was a fresh deployment on top of Cycle, because we all know that moving between different orchestration platforms there's a lot of intricacies that get involved in that process, especially if you're moving away from Kubernetes.
Right.
Not saying that we haven't had companies that have done that, but in terms of having a defined migration process, I don't think that's an answer we have yet today.
Yeah.
But as time goes on, I'm guessing that more and more companies, as they do that, will be able to have a better defined process for that. But the good thing is that Cycle is OCI compliant, right? So as long as if you're building containers that run on Kubernetes or run on Docker, those exact same containers will run on Cycle, even though we're not built on top of Docker, nor are we built on top of Kubernetes. And so it just makes it, at least from a container perspective, it's easy. Now, the big question that we always get when we have these companies coming to us is, hey, back with Kubernetes, I was using this ingress controller, and I was using this, and I was using that, and I was using this, and these people actually start looking for issues almost, because like they come into Cycle expecting it to almost be Kubernetes. Like, you always once you learn something, you always kind of approach things with like it should probably be the same way. And so we always tell companies and developers that are trying Cycle, like, hey, give it 2 weeks, because if during that first week, maybe 2 weeks, you're going to make it more difficult on yourself, because you're going to be looking for problems that you used to have to solve that Cycle just does for you, kind of behind the scenes, right? Like, we automatically scale load balancers for you. We automatically set up VPNs and networks and SDN networks, and we manage DNS. Like, there's so many things that we do behind the scenes that, like, people who are used to doing it themselves almost get confused, because they want to continue doing it themselves until they realize they don't have to. And we call that the magic moment, that moment where people finally realize that they don't have to do all these things. And that's when people get really, you're really excited about Cycle, because now they realize, like, oh, wow, I really can focus exclusively on writing code and building applications and not maintaining all these other things. But it's a weird kind of shift that has to happen.
So let me make sure I got some of the key points here. So we're talking about running standard OCI or Docker images, right? So those don't change. I'm using my own cloud provider. Is that true? In all cases?
So it's a cloud provider that we support. So right now we support AWS, Equinix, Metal, and Vultr. We have a number of other infrastructure providers that we expect to launch over the next quarter.
Okay. But am I paying that bill to them, or?
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not just all paying it to you, and then you happen to be using AWS behind the scenes or whatever, right? So
correct. And so the first step of the first step of getting started on Cycle is when you get to the provider screen, is selecting which provider or providers you want to use, because Cycle makes it so easy to be multi-cloud that 72% of our customers actually use more than one provider.
That's interesting.
Which is also one of the bigger reasons that people are coming to Cycle, because even if they were using Kubernetes and Kubernetes was working for them at a single provider, like maybe they were using AWS with Kubernetes or EKS or whatever, but they're saying, hey, I want to also run bare metal in more regions, or I want to build my own edge network where I'm running in multiple providers with the exact same container with the exact same configuration. And Cycle makes that super, super easy, because the general idea with Cycle is that once you have infrastructure deployed, assuming you don't add like tags and criteria and, like where you're actually narrowing down like a subset of infrastructure, Cycle will treat all of that infrastructure as a single pool of resources. So like once you're in our interface, you never have to log into AWS or any of these other providers again. You can do everything from that one interface, but you are still managing your infrastructure through that interface, because you're dropping in, once you choose that provider that you want to use, you're putting in an API key. And then we are just deploying that infrastructure, managing it for you at that point.
Nice. So, yeah, my experience has been that there's a lot of hype about multi-cloud on the internet, but there's far fewer people able to achieve that in any meaningful, significant way that doesn't just add more potential failures. Because the whole idea of it is to be more redundant, but often I will find it's very fragile during people's designs and implementation phases. And there's one load balancer on one of them that will cause both to crash, or if it goes down or whatever. So it's a very it's an easy thing to talk about, a hard thing to do. And, all this infrastructure stuff is hard enough. And multi-cloud just, I think, magnifies that, 10 times the complexity. So why don't we, I think I've got a feeling for, because I did no prep. So for those of you watching, I don't know Cycle. So I'm acting like a new customer. I'm like, what do I need to do to consider this? So I haven't seen anything about the interface or any of the walkthroughs, and I know you have some demos prepared, so let's just dive into that, and maybe we can talk through some examples. Those of you watching, the reason you're here is to ask questions, so fire away when you see something you want to talk about more, and let's see what we can do here.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'll zoom in and make this a little bit easier to see. Actually, I'll zoom back out for just a second. So this is the dashboard. This is the general interface. I know that I'm on a screen with some crazy resolution right now, so I know this is not super readable to anyone that's watching this on mobile. But I'll zoom in for the next part of this. So this is the dashboard. One of the big things that I want to focus on here is that this version number. So these are a couple servers that are online in sorry, these are a couple servers that are online within this hub, and we can see that we have a server here running at Packet, we have two servers running at Vultr, and we have a server running at AWS. So the three providers that we currently support. If I go back, you can see the version of Cycle that is running on this node. So this is a build from January 4th, and this kind of goes back to how I was talking about before, how everything is always automatically up to date. Just the fact that Cycle deploys these updates, and our users don't have to worry about maintaining that orchestration layer. If I zoom back out for a second and I go over to this infrastructure tab, I can go here and I can scroll over here and click Add Servers. And I can choose a provider, right? So these are any of the providers that I have integrated with on this account. And so, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of integration, all that means is that I gave Cycle access or an API key to my account at these providers. So if I wanted to go ahead and let's say I want to deploy a server over at Vultr, I can click Vultr. I can see what regions I can deploy into. So let's go ahead and choose Chicago. And then at the bottom of the screen here, I can click Next. And this will bring me up a list of all these servers that I can deploy at Vultr. So we can see there's some bare metal servers in here. There's some virtual machines. And let's go ahead and let's just say we wanted to deploy a single 4 gigabyte virtual machine, and maybe we wanted to deploy another 8 gigabyte virtual machine. So we can see these two servers these two virtual machines listed over here on the right hand side. We can choose what cluster we want them into. And you can give it its own name. So you could be like, oh, let's say this is a demo cluster. And clustering is really important because even though this infrastructure can be at different providers and such, clustering is how you tell Cycle that whatever is living on this subset of infrastructure should not have anything to do with any other clusters, right? It's that isolation between different applications and things. Anything living within one cluster will have no concept of anything living in a different cluster. If I scroll down, I have this button to deploy this infrastructure. If I were to deploy that, if I were to click this button, Cycle would immediately go and deploy these servers at that Vultr account, and would immediately be able to. Those servers would come online without any further configuration needed. And so we do that via iPXE. So it's actually really cool because we are not sending images of Cycle to any of these providers when these servers boot up. They are pulling Cycle OS from the internet. So every time your server boots, you have the latest version of our operating system. And our operating system is a very, very, very thin operating system built specifically for running containers. Like it does almost nothing. In fact, it doesn't ever get installed to disk. And once it's running, there's no SSH. It never gets installed to disk. It lives exclusively in RAM. And all of the heavy lifting was actually pushed over into the containers themselves. And so that's where, when I talk about the automatic updates, we are pushing new service containers to these servers that enable new functionality and things. And from that point forward. So that's kind of the infrastructure perspective of Cycle. And then after you have this infrastructure online, then you can begin deploying containers to it. And I guess the last part of the infrastructure component is, as part of being in a Cycle network, you can see, load averages, RAM usage, storage usage, the version of the kernel that is running on the server, just all that general information, or all of that high-level information. We collect it every 30 seconds. So it's just a really easy way of even watching your infrastructure from a single pane of glass, even if that infrastructure is sitting at different providers or in different regions.
Okay.
And then I don't want to spend too much time diving into this, but the last thing I want to show is kind of this quick demo is is environments. So environments are collections of containers that are able to communicate with each other, and so that's how you have segmentation, right? So you can have a server that is multi-tenant, where you have different applications that have no concept of each other living on the same infrastructure, or even different across different providers. So like if I were to create a new environment, and here let me zoom in, I can click create environment. I can go over here. I can give it a name. We'll just say this is a demo. We can choose what cluster we want it in. We'll just throw it on our production cluster. We can choose whether we want this to be an environment without any containers, like pre-existing containers, or we can choose from a stack. From a stack is very similar to it's Cycle's version of like a Helm chart or a Docker Compose file. We can go ahead and create that environment. We are now in this environment. We can see on this the left-hand side here, or sorry, right-hand side, we have a discovery service, a VPN service, and a load balancer that are automatically created. And so, as I mentioned earlier in the show, how Cycle will not only build these services, but will automatically maintain them, right? So if I were to go ahead and deploy a container, which will be the last step that I'll show with this, I can give it a name. We'll just say this is like a front end. We can say whether we want this container to be stateless or stateful. We'll just keep it as stateless. We can say how many we want. Let's say we want 4 copies of this. We can choose a deployment strategy. So we can say like, let's put it on the servers that first check in and tell us that they're available. We can manually define where we want these instances of this container to live. We can balance it out with resource density. So that way, if we have X number of different servers, that the RAM usage and CPU usage is growing equally, or we could say high availability. So if we say high availability here, Cycle will pool all of our infrastructure, not pool, it'll sample all of our infrastructure, kind of build a layout of like, hey, where can I take these containers and deploy them so that they are the geographically most distributed and across the most providers, the most regions. So that way, if we have a region go down or provider go down, there's limited risk to this application actually being offline. We can choose an image that we've imported. And so as I mentioned earlier, these are any OCI compliant images. One of the differences with Cycle versus a lot of other platforms is when you import an image, and you can import an image from like a Docker registry, Docker Hub, or you can do like a build directly off of a Git repo as long as there's a Docker file inside of it. We actually store all of those images on our side. So that way, if Docker Hub or your registry or whatever goes down, that image is always ready to go if you need to scale. Once you have that image in Cycle, you completely are independent of any other registries or anything else on the web. So if I go here and we'll just deploy our getting started image. We can choose whether we want this container to be publicly accessible or not. Let's say yeah. We can define what ports we want to open. We'll say 8080. We'll create our container. And so we can see this is our container. We had 4 instances that we said we wanted to start. If we go to our instances tab here, we can see that we only had 2 servers in this cluster, but Cycle decided to balance both of them, these 4 instances over those 2 servers by putting 2 servers two instances per server. If I go ahead and start this, we can say start, and very quickly we'll see these 4 instances boot. And there we go. And now if we connect to one of the consoles for one of them, we can see the output of that individual instance. And if we wanted to move, this instance right now is running over at Vultr. If we wanted to move this instance over to our infrastructure at Equinix Metal, formerly Packet, it's as easy as choosing the new server. And let's say we want to move. And over on this left-hand side, boom, we can see that instances move. So if this was a stateless instance, but if this was a stateful instance, Cycle would automatically take care of moving all the data as well. Just to keep things really, really simple. Again, because it's from one interface, we're moving stuff between providers, and there's not anything else that we've had to do as part of that process.
Right.
And finally, if I go back to demo, and if I were to start this environment, it'll start the discovery service, it'll start the load balancer. And we can see that it acquired a IPv6 address and an IPv4 address. Cycle is natively IPv6 for like all container-to-container communication is IPv6 native. But we do allocate IPv4 and IPv6 for the load balancer itself. And then so this container would now, if we pointed a domain to this IP, the load balancer would automatically learn that, and we could immediately hit that container. There's nothing else that we would have to do. And so yeah, that's a quick high level of cycle.
Nice. You mentioned stacks earlier, and I while you were talking, I was looking up stacks on your documentation. So I guess there's a stack file I can use, so I can get control all this from Git rather than from the GUI.
Yes. So if you have, a stack file is a definition that describes an entire environment. So you can customize the load balance. You can just define all the different services and all the different containers within that interface. So yes, once you create an image source, over here on the left hand side, you could create an image source and point that to a Git repo. I guess we can quickly kind of dive into that. So add image source. I can give it a name. Let's say this is our, let's say it's a demo app. We can choose Docker file. Sorry, you were asking about stacks. Yes, stacks. Yeah, sorry, stacks.
That's okay.
We can import stacks.
That was interesting, so I was going to let you go with it. So,
sorry.
Yeah, stacks.
Yeah. Yeah, stack. So we can do import from Git repo. Where you can put in the credentials, a specific hash or tag that you want. You can, define your authentication details, and then you can once you create the stack here, you can actually define a pipeline that will allow you to hit that stack over and over and over. So that way, every time you were to make a change to the Git repo, you could trigger the re-import of the stack and the redeployment of the stack through code. So that if you wanted to build like a CI/CD process, you could take stacks, pair it with pipelines, and make that happen.
Nice. And pipelines is like the automation?
Correct. Yeah, so pipelines was one of the newer features we released, and so we can. Let's see. We'll go into this QA pipeline. You can see that this specific pipeline says it'll import, or it'll create a new image from source. Will break. I'm guessing one of our developers was testing that something would break. It sends a post webhook to here. So this is one of. This is one of the more weird features of pipelines, where you actually can have like a pipeline, like obviously do stuff on cycle, but then in the process, once something is successful, you can have it submit like information about that last step to something else. So that way, like, if you submit, in this case, it's going to submit a post to this URL, and if this returns with a 200, we know that it's able to move on to the next step. So that way, like, you can have like integration tests and things like that built into the pipeline itself, where you're kind of doing like third-party validation outside of cycle for certain things. But yeah, so pipelines are used for not CI usually. Most of our customers will use like Jenkins or something for CI, but we built pipelines specifically to solve the CD component of pipeline.
Okay,
automation.
That makes sense. CD pipelines. So that means that you're not building images for people from code. You're basically expecting people to have their images wherever they want them, right? In whatever registry. Is that true?
So we can pull in images from registry, and that's the path I ended up going down.
Oh, okay.
Initially was, if you add an image source, you can choose like a Docker file, and then you can define whether you want to import a tarball or use a Git repo. And if you define a Git repo, you can define the path to a Docker file here. We will git clone that repo, and we'll git clone that repo, and then do the build on our side in what we call our factory service. So if you wanted to do all the builds from Cycle's perspective, you could do that as well.
All right. Nice. This is a very detailed question, but does that build use a standard OCI build tool like BuildKit, or
yes, we use BuildKit.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. That's my favorite, so I was kind of hoping you'd say that. So Conrad's got some questions. I'm going to just start firing away while you were showing off the product. He was saying that, are there plans to have a local provider for development purposes that would use Kind, Minikube, and so that we wouldn't run up a bill when using these public clouds?
So we are at the end of 2022, so later this year, looking into, or sorry, planning on developing a very like high level simple approach to local development where you can run like an extended cycle version, on your own machine, but it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be with a Kubernetes distro. Because again, like the whole approach with cycle being non-Kubernetes, it'd be weird to kind of pull that in at the last step. And so the hope there is to accomplish two things. One is that you'd be able to run these containers locally, et cetera, and do some quick testing. But then two is being able to I'm trying to figure out like the best way of kind of explaining this, but one of the things we want to accomplish is where if you have a Docker file locally that you're testing, that when you say like, like how you do like Docker run, et cetera, and start that container, if you were to do the equivalent of cycle run, you're doing that, but we're also using the VPN connection that cycle natively builds so that container is running inside an environment. So that way, if you're testing, like if you say, hey, I have this environment running on cycle that has a database inside of it, I want to connect as though this container is running on top of cycle, even though it's on my local machine, but that way everything is native. So you're deploying in the exact same way with host names and
Right.
VXLAN networks, et cetera, as you would. We want that container to feel like it's running on top of cycle, even if it's running on your local machine.
Right. So is the goal there it's obviously no Kubernetes, but is the goal there to also replace like Docker Desktop and Compose, and it's literally running its own virtualization or containerization platform or on your Mac or Windows machine? Is that kind of the hope?
That's the hope, is to keep it very, very simple. We probably wouldn't support as many operating systems as Docker does, just because like our team is a lot smaller than Docker.
Sure.
But I mean, it's one of those things that as the company grows that we probably dive into a lot more. But the initial, let's say the alpha version of it would be, how can I run a container locally and make it seem as though it's running in the cycle environment with the rest of our stuff? Because like we have a lot of people that use cycle for stateful workloads, right? Because like they're saying, hey, with Kubernetes it was so hard to run a stateful workload. Like Kubernetes made stateless workloads pretty easy, but stateful workloads have been a whole problem to solve. And with cycle, when we were going through the development processes, we said, kind of like pairing all my infrastructure knowledge and stuff from over time, I was like, stateful is hard. Let's do that first, because I figure it's always easier to go from stateful to stateless, because you're just at that point you're removing stuff than going the other way around and then having to introduce all these extra paradigms to support stateful. So we went the opposite way, and it's one of the reasons why we have some people, or why I think one of the biggest draws to cycle is, hey, I have a stateful whatever this is, I need to run it. I want to run it alongside the rest of my applications, run it alongside the rest of my containers. And so point there is that when we build that application that would run locally, being able to extend into cycle where your stateful workloads are in likely a database or something that you care about is, you don't want to have to run all of that locally if you have a development environment set up. So like, the second part of Conrad's question was so that you wouldn't run up a bill using these public clouds. But with cycle, since everything ends up being we're able to utilize so much more of that underlying infrastructure, because you have the load balancer and everything else that is living on top of this infrastructure, that you're talking, depending on what infrastructure you're using, you might be, most of our, we'll just very simply say, most of our customers have a development environment set up and running that is, compared to their total cost, is just it's something that is not meaningful to them, right? Like in terms of the cost to support that development cluster.
Right. And I'm imagining that a lot of people coming to you and they already have their own local development setups as well, like that, based on the previous conversation. So it's one of those things where you tell everybody they got to replace everything they're doing, and it becomes a heavy lift to move. I can see that. You mentioned the stateful stuff, so I want to jump on that topic for a minute, because having that sysadmin background, I've previously everything was stateful. So up until recently, stateless wasn't even really a word that we asked people. We didn't know about that, right? So it's a luxury that we're actually nowadays recognizing the benefits of stateless and trying to achieve that whenever possible. So when you talk about your stateful, are people running their own containerized databases and doing that themselves, or are you providing that? Can they connect to like existing cloud services like RDS or other like where if I'm going to run databases and message queues in my app, what are my options with Cycle?
The answer is all of the above. So we have customers that do, like if they're using AWS for some of their infrastructure, they'll have. So one of the options when you're deploying a container is that you can. We'll just jump into this for a second. Oh, sorry.
You're fine. I saw you moving.
So one of the options here is egress only, right? So if you have a container that's in AWS, if you're using a container, or if you're deploying a container on infrastructure that is in AWS, Cycle will automatically build its own VPC. If you deploy like an Aurora DB on AWS to that VPC, as long as this network is set to egress only, you can connect to that Aurora DB or whatever other AWS service that you're using, as long as it's deployed to that VPC as well. Then we also have some companies that are using like Mongo Atlas and things like that. So we have some companies doing it that way. We have other companies that are deploying full like Mongo replica sets on top of Cycle, where they're letting the database itself handle all replication. And then they'll introduce. We're getting ready to release a conductor framework, so that way you can build like I think Kubernetes calls it like sidecars, where you're having a container that lives alongside the cluster and can make decisions about when to scale and when not to scale and things like that. Yeah, I mean, very simply, the answer to your question is yes. We have companies doing all of what you had originally inquired in terms of how they want to manage those applications.
Right. All right. What about backups of that stateful data sets? Like, is that something you handle as well, where you're just automatically backing everything up? Or
yes. So that was a feature that we launched earlier this year. It was a partnership that we did with BackBlaze. And it is one of the neatest features of how we built Cycle, or sorry, maybe not how we built Cycle, but one of the implementations that we did, because it's just so, I think, different than a lot how many other people would have approached it. And what I mean by that is here, if I go to back to settings here, and I go to integrations, we can integrate with BackBlaze here by just dropping in different details for it, and we can connect, right? But if I go to environments here, and let's go to a stateful container. Let's see, this container is stateful, so let's go to this database, and we'll go to config, and we can go to integrations, and then choose backups. And so here we can choose where we want to back up to. So in this case, like if we chose BackBlaze, and this is the part where I was talking about where things get really fun. So with Cycle, you can input a command here. So this is like if you wanted to back up MySQL, you could like do MySQL dump, or Mongo, you could do Mongo. I think it's Mongo dump. You could use whatever command you want. But the reason we did it this way is there's so many other kind of platforms out there that when they do backups, it's like, hey, just point this at a directory. But if you were to point Cycle, or if you were to point a backup solution at a directory, and that directory maybe you're making changes to that directory while you're backing it up. Maybe MySQL's still writing to that directory, Mongo's still writing to that directory. You don't know, like you might be backing up something that is in the middle of a write, like, and you don't know that. Like, there's a lot of risk. So the idea here was, how can we allow companies to do native backups using the application's own preferred way of doing backups, but allow that to be super customizable, right? So what's really neat here is with this command, you can put in, like I said, MySQL dump, and as long as that MySQL command, or as long as that command outputs to standard out, we back it up. So what we do is as if you were to do MySQL dump and back up to standard output, we in 64 kilobyte chunks read that and then aggregate it and push it over to your file, or to your bucket over on BackBlaze. So it's really cool because you're using native backups, right? You're not using any extra disk space on your server other than 64 kilobyte chunks, right, as we're outputting it. So you're able. So if you have a container that only has like a 10 gigabyte, if you're backing up a container that only has a 10 gigabyte volume attached to it, and if you're using 9 gigabytes of that 10 gigabytes, you definitely can't back up that 9 gigabytes into that remaining gigabyte, right? And so the idea was, hey, if we can back up in 64 kilobyte chunks, and I mean it still ends up being one big file at your backup
Right.
provider.
So it's like
But
you're
if we
like
can,
backup, you're streaming backups basically.
I'm
Yeah.
literally streaming backups. Yeah.
Yeah.
In those, everything in Cycle is written in Golang, so we're just doing an IO, copy onto another stream and backing up whatever you output to standard out. And then it's the same for restore. If you were to define a restore command, whether that's, I think it's MySQL import. I don't remember. I think it's MySQL import, but point is still the same. If you use standard input, as long as you listen to standard input, we will populate standard input with 64 kilobyte chunks. And as long as you read in those 64 kilobyte as long as you are reading from standard input, you will have your backup there again without using any extra disk space in the process.
Very cool. I like that. I'm a fan of BackBlaze too. I use stuff there personally and professionally all the time. So cool.
They've been a great partner to Cycle. Yeah. We have a lot of other neat things coming out with them, or in the works with them. But
sidebar, I love when they break out a new version of their hardware model, like for storage. And it's always really cool. Like, how can we get 5 petabytes and a 2U rack or whatever? And they break down all the components, and they basically give you a list of things to buy to build it yourself. It's really interesting when hardware companies or hardware software, or SaaS, I guess you could call them, sort of give you all the information to build it yourself, because obviously it's a lot of work to do it. So there's not a lot of competition. So they're not probably worried about people stealing their ideas, but it is really cool that they open source their hardware models. That's neat.
Well, and one of the other thing that I like that they do is when they do their quarterly blog, and they mention, like, they go into all all of the different hard drives that they have running in their data center, and they talk about, like, hey, this manufacturer, this model number or whatever, had
right. The failure rates.
Failure.
Yeah,
failure rates of all the different models. It's like, only a company like BackBlaze, that is running exabytes of storage is able to have that much of a
statistics,
kind of a sample size.
Yeah, sample size. That's perfect. All right, so I promised the people that I'd get to some more of their questions. Conrad's got some more. Actually, Chris answered them, I believe, but I'm just going to put this in there for the audio listeners. Conrad was saying, I was thinking I would get things working and test on the free plan and migrate to Lite or Business when the app goes live. Is it easy to migrate from the free plan to Lite or Business?
Yes. The all of this is a billing change. There's no changes to infrastructure. There's no changes to anything else. It's literally a one-click button in the maybe a 2-click button in the interface.
Right. All right. Next up, Conrad's stealing all the thunder right now. Is Cycle a replacement for your DevOps team at the small and medium app developer level? When should one consider and use Cycle? We kind of already covered that, but what's the gist of that?
Yeah. So at least from our perspective, or our sales approach today, we found that our niche today, as we're continuing to build awareness within the space and things like that, is we try to target companies that have between 4 and 50 developers. That's been our sweet spot. Like, if a company has 1 or 2 developers, like, yeah, Cycle can still be valuable to them. But there's a certain kind of point where it's like, some people are like, yeah, I'll just, what I'm building is not sophisticated enough. I'll just throw it on a single Docker, or I'll deploy a single VM and throw a Docker on it. But for companies that are looking to scale over time, that's where Cycle really fits in, because it's so easy to add infrastructure and then scale those instances over more servers. So yeah, we usually target is somewhere in that development range, or that number of developers.
Yeah.
For those companies.
That's a good guide. I like that. Andrew's asking, can I harden the servers to meet higher security requirements?
So I'd have to know more of what the security requirements were desired there, but I guess we can kind of dive into that very quickly. So from a security perspective, Cycle defaults to everything being in its most secure by default. So what does that mean? 1, we don't have SSH on the server. 2, when the operating system is booted, it lives in RAM exclusively. And when it fully starts, the last step is to remount the operating system in read-only. So that way you can't even make a change to the operating system once our agent is on that box. Our agent becomes read-only, but the operating system itself is no longer. And in terms of like what ports are open, the only ports that are open are the ports for your load balancer and VXLAN. Like those are the only thing. VXLAN because your servers need to talk to each other with
Yeah.
networks, and the IPs, the ports that we open within your load balancers. And then in terms of like how to cycle communicate with these servers are a client to cycle. So that way, even if you're behind a firewall and everything, there's no ingress traffic from cycle coming into your server. Your server connects back out to cycle. So that way the ports are open on our side. And I guess one thing that I do want to clarify with that, when I say like there's no SSH, there's a lot of developers that will say like, well, that's weird. Like I want SSH. Like if you take away my SSH capabilities, like why? Why would you do that? And there's two things. One, if we give developers the ability to SSH into the underlying host and they start making changes to IP routing or networking or any of these things, we can no longer reliably push updates to you. Right, like that. Our biggest value is that you don't have to care about these updates. So if you start making changes and it's not through our platform, we don't know what changes you've made. Right. So that's one. But two is we've made a way for you to SSH into your containers. That is actually really cool. It's my favorite feature. And so Bret, if you're okay with it, I'll spend like 30 seconds and show that part.
Yeah, let's do it.
It's my absolute favorite feature in Cycle. So I'm back at my containers here, and if I go to a dashboard for this environment, actually let's go to the environment that we deployed earlier. Let's go to the front end container. So we have this front end. We have these instances that we deployed. Let's say I wanted to connect to this specific instance. So obviously I can see the console here in the interface, right? But that's just a one-way console. That just allows me to see what's happening.
Right.
Exactly. Right. But over here in the upper left-hand corner, as I zoom up, there's a button here that says Request SSH Access. So if I click that, it drops down an address and a password. And so if I copy that and I paste it in a clipboard here, it asks for a password. I can copy that, put that in, and now I'm inside of this container. But it's really, really neat if in terms of what just happened here. I'll zoom in a little bit more. So you can see when we connected to a console service that is sitting outside of your infrastructure. So we did not open any ports. We did not install SSH to any of your containers. We did none of that. This port is open on a console service sitting outside of your infrastructure. And that token that we just logged in as, so this token here will expire within 29 minutes and 15 seconds. Or if we want to expire right now, done. Now no one can log in with that. So so in terms of like if you're a development team where you're continuing to add more developers and maybe developer leaves or or a developer ends up getting fired or something where you need to remove their access, removing their Cycle account from your hub, immediately all access is gone. There's no keys that you have to go hunt down. There's no extra authentication. It's just super simple.
Right.
And then the other neat thing with this is if I move this instance between different providers, this will automatically figure out how to SSH into it, even right after a migration. So it's not like I have to sit here and re-guess things. Cycle just does it.
Right.
And so that's my favorite feature because it's just
that's pretty nice.
It's so easy.
It feels like a Docker exec without needing Docker.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's always going to make everyone happy because we always get nervous when we can't actually interact with a misbehaving system or try to figure out from just logs are never sufficient. It seems like no matter how much we improve logging, I'm always like, I wish it actually logged that thing, and I'm not seeing anything about that thing. So it's nice. It's nice to have that as a backup plan. Andrew also asks, I'm gonna keep rapid firing. Andrew also asks, do you support Windows? Basically, he's asking about Windows.NET framework, so Windows hosts.
Unfortunately, no. We haven't had enough customers ask for it. And again, that kind of goes back to how we started this episode of we only build things that 80% or more want. And we've I think in the time that we've been building this over the years, I think we might have had 3 or 4 people inquire about Windows. So it's just such a small subset for the people who are coming to us. Not that it's obviously not usable to some people, but to the people who have been coming to us, it has not been enough of an ask for us to work into figuring out a solution there.
Yeah, I'm sure Andrew has their opinions, but the nice thing there is that if you are focused on greenfield customers or greenfield projects at least, I'm imagining a lot of teams nowadays are looking at, well, what used to be called .NET Core, which is also Linux supported. So the current .NET is multi-platform. So that's where, because I'm an old Windows admin that seems to be friends with all the Windows people. So my worldview is that there's a lot of them, even though I feel like over time the number of Windows developers per server is shrinking. But they're all either already on projects for moving to Linux or considering moving to Linux. Not necessarily changing from .NET or to something else, but just using .NET in the new Linux builds. All right. Moz is asking, please provide more details about how Cycle handles the stateful across multi-cluster.
I'm guessing multi-cluster being a multi-provider or multi-cloud, because with Cycle, once you define a cluster, applications cannot live across clusters. That's a very purposeful decision. But against multiple clouds, over multiple clouds or providers, it's the exact same way as stateless from a UI perspective or an API perspective. Is as long as as we go back to I realize my screen's not being shared. It's very no, sorry. But there you go. This main option here is the big thing, is stateless versus stateful. Now I'm guessing that the underlying reason or kind of the inherent kind of maybe context of that question is like, how do I handle replication and things like that? And with Cycle, we've decided early on that the platform itself should never handle data replication, because if me as a platform figuring out how to replicate your bits, I don't know how to do it the best way. Your application likely knows how to do that better than mine. It's why Mongo has replication built into Mongo, right? So we try to step out of that as much as we can. But in terms of failover, which I'm guessing is the second part, which would kind of inherently be a second part of that question, with Cycle, we don't believe in failover. And I know that's a really weird thing to say, but we don't believe in active passive, maybe is the better way of saying it. With Cycle, the general idea is that if something is important enough to you that you don't want it to ever go down, it should always be running active. So when you deploy a container that's stateful, if you want to make sure that it will never go down, it's running multiple copies of it. And yes, that means that in some cases it will cost more. But some of the reasoning there is, like, back when I was at SingleHop, we'd see so many companies go through that process of deploying, or building really elaborate failover processes. But then when shit would hit the fan and things would go, not when things would go wrong.
Right.
Things wouldn't fail over properly, right? And then they'd still be down. And so with Cycle, our whole philosophy is if everything is stateless, sorry, not stateless, if everything is active, you're not hoping that something happens when something bad happens, because it's just already there. And so we run our platform in the exact same manner, right? So Cycle's core, which is obviously the portal, the API, the build systems, everything that our customer infrastructure is connecting back to, is scaled across every provider we support. And I don't want to throw shade, but one of our providers had a pretty big outage about 2.5-3 weeks ago or something like that. And Cycle didn't even know anything was wrong. I mean, we had some customers that were only running infrastructure at the provider that had that experienced an outage.
Experienced it, yeah, on their infrastructure.
But the platform itself was perfectly fine, because we took that same approach of we run a duplicate core of Cycle across every provider. And with load balancing and things like that, we are kind of built in for the situation that if something goes wrong, everything else is already online, to help mitigate that. So yeah,
I completely subscribe to that opinion, and I love the way you say it, that everything should be active. There is no active passive or active fail or active plus failover, because for decades, I've been a part of teams that implement the idea of failover. I can remember projects where the failover data center was costing us, $10,000 a month in infrastructure for something that never received a packet, right? And it would just sit there because they didn't want things turned off, and it wasn't that type of failover. They actually had things turned on, but load balancing was routing to a different location, and then we would have to implement failover testing evolutions, right? Where we're all like working after hours and we're all nervous because it hasn't been failed over tested in 6 months and there's been a bunch of updates. So then we fail over. And then of course there's always work to be done to mitigate a failover problem that we didn't anticipate. So then that goes, and you end up with like basically a failover team that manages for D-Day or whatever. And it's one of those things where it's like almost like developing a product that no one uses because you're working so hard to develop this failover idea, but it rarely, if ever, gets used in a real context, and it's only for testing because you're testing. Honestly, it always gets pushed off. Like the dev team's like, we're too busy on a release right now. We don't have time for a failover test, right? So then you're always sort of not feeling like it's an important thing. It's kind of like testing backups, right? People talk about testing backups, but very few people do because it's low priority. It's working today. We tested it last year. I'm sure it's still fine, even though it's probably totally not. So I love that your attitude is on that because that, exactly like you're saying, you obviously have time in the trenches because the failover model is a failed model. I should quote that.
It is.
The failover model is a failed model.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the point that that you just made with backups and failover, but then extending that all the way to Kubernetes. Like the problem we have as developers and DevOps engineers is that when you get something that finally works, you move on to something and you just inherently deprioritize anything before. Whether that's making sure your Kubernetes is up to date, making sure your backups work, making sure that you're ready for a failover, right? And so that's the whole cycle. It's like this whole model is run everything as though everything matters, but the things that are redundant that you don't have to care about, let cycle watch for you, right? Like if a backup fails, it'll just tell you. Like there's, it's just very upfront with a lot of those things that are easy to forget. And so that's kind of been the general approach for so many of these things. It's more of a mindset than like, I mean, yes, I'm proud of our technology, but it's the mindset behind it that I think is maybe taking a different approach to things, I guess, is more of what I'm saying.
Right. Well, and I appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to rapid fire again. Andrew's asking for a timeline of Azure support.
So Azure support was something we actually had a meeting about yesterday in the office. And so we're hoping to have Azure released sometime probably in Q3 of this year. We tried to add support for Azure at one point, but they had the whole like Linux agent thing. And so the problem was that when we would deploy servers into Azure, because we weren't running, a cloud init image with Azure's Linux agent, all of these servers would report as unhealthy. And it's like, they were perfectly fine. There was nothing wrong with them. It was just Azure's model did not work with the idea of having a stateless operating system that let's say a lockdown operating system, because like I said, it gets mounted read-only after you start it. You can't make changes to it. And their model, expecting cloud in it and things like that did not work. So I'm hoping we have not had a chance to dive into that again. This was like 2 years ago, but I'm hoping that when we dive in again this year, that not having the Linux agent or cloud init support in an image does not yield this server is unhealthy and things like that. So
yeah, that would be a little misleading, and it would make us nervous if one console was saying it's fine, the other console is telling me it's down. Your OS sounds a lot like LinuxKit. Is it related to that project?
It's built on top of LinuxKit.
Yes.
So it's LinuxKit. It's LinuxKit with a custom kernel. It's LinuxKit with a custom kernel, and then a number of extra like binaries and things like that added to it.
You're throwing a lot of containers in there, yeah. That's really cool because I've been looking. I mean, I was a big fan of LinuxKit early on, and it was very low. It was very low level, and I was kind of hoping to use it on some projects where people wanted to look at embedded stuff or wanted to ship their images as sort of like a VM, sort of the old days of us all shipping VMware images as a embedded option for people that didn't want to have to manage the OS. And it always felt like you had to be you had to know Linux kernel, you had to know Linux, the basics of Linux building an OS. So you basically had to understand OS building, and it wasn't really ready for like end users. It never really got that success of being a friendly thing for the average infrastructure person. And it's great to hear a success story because I know that Docker and others, the community put a lot of work into that project. And they don't have like a blog that talks about LinuxKit success or anything like that. So it's nice to hear that somebody's found usefulness with this.
It definitely took a lot of time, kind of like trial and error, trying to make it work, during, because again, I mean, we started adopting LinuxKit back in 2017. So before that, we had built like a static image, we took, I think back then it was like we had Fedora as like the base OS, and then like we threw like a binary into it, like, all right, well, this kind of works, but we didn't reach MVP at that point yet. So like no. Like we were just testing that internally, but then we were at DockerCon. I think it was DockerCon Austin, or was it maybe Seattle?
Yeah. Well, Austin's when they announced it. I actually remember. Yeah, it was 2017. Yep.
Yeah. So DockerCon Austin, and me and my co-founder at the time were sitting there, and we're like, this is how we do it. This solves the problem we had.
Yeah.
And so I think before we left Austin, we had started rewriting our OS build process to use LinuxKit. And like I said, it took a lot of time, because LinuxKit solved a lot of issues, but one of the things that makes Cycle more tricky, I think, than many cases, is the fact that we try to build and deploy the exact same image to every provider, right? Mm-hmm. And when you have AWS that handles networking different than a bare metal server, whether even if that's something related to something as simple as DHCP, or how Vultr does expects neighbor announcements for IPv6, where most bare metal providers they just give you it in a metadata API, right? So like that's one of the other challenges that we had to figure out with LinuxKit images. How do we have a base image that is standard enough but flexible enough to boot on every provider, just long enough to download some other proprietary stuff that allows us to take it and once that other proprietary stuff runs, every server looks the same as every other server, regardless of what provider it's at. Yeah, we've just standardized it. So that way, when our compute process starts and then your containers start, we don't have to care about the underlying provider anymore, because it's been fully standardized from that point forward. Which makes it so easy, so that, like, as I was showing in the demo, when you want to move a container between providers, it's just super simple. Like, there's nothing extra that needs to be. I mean, I know that was the main goal of containers anyway, but like there's other intricacies that go into there, especially when you start dealing with networks that need to extend across providers and things like that.
Well, that and we've never really fully realized that dream all the way up and down the stack, right? Like containers don't solve the entire stack problem, and I deal with customers every week that are dealing with different ingress providers in Kubernetes across different platforms, different clouds, and how do they create ingress rules that work everywhere? Like, everything's getting better all the time, but we're far from done.
Yes.
All right. Next quick question: how to approach service mesh in Cycle? So I guess maybe a different way to ask that question is, if I don't get the Kubernetes service mesh style of functionality, what are comparables in Cycle, and how do I relate to what service mesh does for most people in Kubernetes?
So that's always a weird question, because like with Cycle, we just kind of entirely got rid of the whole reason of behind having a service mesh in the capacity that Kubernetes approaches it, right? Like obviously, in Cycle, as I had shown during the demo, Cycle does have services. We have discovery, we have VPN, we have load balancers, but these are all maintained automatically for you. Like they live on your infrastructure, yes, as other containers, but it's not something that you have to make changes for. That being said, one of our long-term goals is to make it so that you can run your own service containers, because like a service container is really just a container with extra access. Like it's allowed to ask for more questions about the underlying server that it's running on, right? And so just like how you with like Docker, how you can mount the Docker API into the container. Well, Cycle has we call it the internal API. It's just a Unix socket that gets mounted inside all service containers, and then service containers can use that API to make changes to the containers in that environment, or the containers in that environment, or the environment itself. And so as time goes on, like we might have people that start building more custom services, but it's really weird. Like I think that And I know that Kubernetes is, again, like we talked about at the beginning, built to kind of solve every issue, right? So like
Yeah.
you really need a lot of those custom service methods or the services that would end up in a service mesh. But with Cycle, like the 3 default services that we package have actually solved so
A
far
lot of
everything that
that.
people have needed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we've been able to keep it very simple. Then Cycle automatically build handles less encrypt certificates, and like there's just so many things that we've just kind of taken care of.
Yeah.
And that was kind of goes back to when we started the podcast, and I was talking about how people usually when they start looking at Cycle, they look for things to solve that they don't need to. And that's why we always tell people, give it 2 weeks, because the first week you're going to spend so much time trying to do things in the way that you used to before it starts to kind of click and you realize you don't have to care about those things anymore.
Yeah.
So it's always kind of a weird question, because like, how do you say like you really don't need to care about it without like coming off as like
Right.
you know what I
Arrogant
mean? Like,
or yeah, not empathetic with their needs. Yeah, I can see the dance you got to do there. That makes sense. All right, I'm gonna. We have gone long. We had a ton of great questions. Nadir, I'm gonna make your question the last one. I don't know if I'm missing a point, but as a team shifting toward an infrastructure as code, I'm wondering if the config Jake has been showing can be driven by versioned code. So you and I already previously in this video we talked a little bit about, and you showed off. Not pipelines. What was the other thing? What was it called? Stacks. Thank you. And there's a stacks file. So maybe I'm going to ask this question a different way for you. What parts of everything we saw today can I control from a Git repo rather than the GUI?
everything from an environment down. So you cannot deploy a server using the stack file, but you can deploy containers, you can manage services, you can manage IPs, you can manage images, you can manage everything from this screen, this environment down. So again, this is an environment, right? So the services here, so discovery, VPN, load balancer, and then all your containers can be in a stack file. The reason we do not include servers in that is that Cycle's model of being active, most people, not all, but most people will have different applications that are unrelated to each other running on the same servers, because the active kind of manner is like, hey, instead of having, as you were talking about earlier, active passive, where that passive is just sitting there, people will say, hey, well, this other server is mainly used for something else, but to stay active, I'm going to throw something else, or a lighter version of something running on it that is there on the chance that I ever need it. And actually that's maybe a little bit confusing. I guess very simply, Cycle's model is built less around auto scaling of the underlying physical infrastructure, of the infrastructure, and more of how you get better utilization out of that infrastructure in an active manner, right? So if you were to start dropping off infrastructure from a stack file and another environment was relying on it, things would get really weird, right? Now, we do have customers that are doing that, but they have an extra step in the process using either a pipeline or the API, because we have a full-blown API that is, our portal is a consumer of our own API. And so you can do some really, 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 really powerful things with our API. But yeah, very simply with the stack, it's environment and down.
Nice. I like it. So it's almost like the GUIs for the Terraform part, and then everything else is can be handled through, is it YAML? I'm assuming YAML.
It's actually JSON.
Okay.
So we initially we supported YAML and JSON, but like 80% of our support requests related to stack files were like, hey, my stack file is not working, and it ended up being like someone had indented a YAML file wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That we were like, you know what, we're gonna go to just JSON.
Okay.
And support for that was just dropped immediately. It's just so much more easy, or so much easier, I think, to validate a JSON file.
I do a lot of YAML linting in my day, so yeah, I can understand that. Well, thank you so much, Jake, for being on the show. I appreciate all the demos, and it sounds like the product is quite complete. It seems like after all these years of work, and I'm excited to hear if anyone in the chat, if you're going to try it out, of course, come back, let me know. We've got the DevOps fan up there above Jake's head. You can go there on our server. And if someone's tried it out and you want to talk about it there in chat, we're there all day talking about DevOps, talking about infrastructure. So I appreciate it. Jake, so we can find you on Twitter at Jake Warner. And
yep.
We can obviously find Cycle at cycle.io. And you have a podcast, right? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so we started a podcast about 6 months ago, maybe seven. But we were looking for a way to help tell our customer story, and tell the story of some of our partners, and just being able to show off some of the different efforts that we've been working on. And so we have the Cycle podcast. You can find it on cycle.io. And we do an episode usually the first week of every month. Obviously, this is the new year, so January is a little bit off, but we do have we usually have a podcast the first week of every month. So
very nice. All right, put that in chat for everyone, and I appreciate you being on. Thanks for being here.
No, it's been a blast. I always love diving into the nitty gritty with other people who've been in the same world. It's just,
right.
It's people who are not technical and developers wouldn't get it.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here. We're going to be here again next week. And let's see, we have no guest next week, so it will probably be a Q&A topic next week. So come in if you got DevOps questions about containers and cloud native stuff. And we will see you next week, the same time here on YouTube Live. Ciao, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.